hands up anybody who has lots to do and not enough time. Okay, so just as an experiment, is there anybody here who has nothing much to do and plenty of time? Just out of curiosity, good. Okay, so most of us have to-do lists, lots of things that we would like to get done and not enough time. So if I just want to set some expectations. The purpose of this session is not to show you how to get rid of all those actions and tasks and lists and activities. It's more about how do you prioritise them and do them in an order that makes sense. Just as a little bit of context, has anyone heard about the improvement cycle before? Has anyone come across the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle? No, okay. So it's a really simple concept, and a lot of professional practice is based on the improvement cycle. So the improvement cycle was developed in the 1920s by Schuhart and then later Deming, and they talked about the need to, when you're working on problems in the workplace, to start by planning things and then actually implement them. Implement them, then check that what you've implemented is actually an improvement, and then go back and make sure that those improvements are systematised and that they're repeatable, that they're embedded in the organisation, and then you start looking for other improvement opportunities. So it's like a cyclical thing, and that's why it's drawn out as a circle. So no one's heard of that before? Okay, really simple concept. So this concept underpins project management. Is anyone here a project manager? Great. So can you describe some of the, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, some of the key steps in project management cycle?
Identifying all the various steps for your end game, what resources are required, whether it's financial or staff or skill sets or whatever it might be. Time frames as well for what each step will take, where to action.
Yep, so that's the plan phase. Yep, and then?
Doing.
And then you come back to, usually a project will finish, if you do it right, with a post-implementation review or something like that. So that's the ACT part of that cycle. Is anyone here in the medical profession? Okay, so nurses tell me that they have, that they learn in their training an improvement cycle as well. So they collect data about the customer or the patient, sorry, and so that's usually observations and so on. They record them, and then they, in consultation, or sometimes it's the doctor, makes a decision about what needs to happen next, and then they continue to monitor, and then they make changes as the patient's health or observations change. So it's also embedded in the social work. Is anyone here from the social work field? No? So again, same sort of understanding. So you've got a client, you try and understand their circumstances, you put in place interventions to help them, and you monitor it and you continue to review. Same sort of cycle. So I'm not sure what industries you're from, but this basic simple concept underpins a lot of professional practice. And throughout this cycle, we use a lot of really simple techniques to help people with improvement. Does anyone know what some of those might be? What kind of improvement techniques do you use? None that come to mind? So what about, have any of you ever done process mapping or collected data about what's going on so that you can analyse the data for improvement? Any of you go talk to customers and find out what they're interested in and what's of value to them? So they're all quite simple techniques. And another one is prioritisation. And I work with a lot of process improvement teams and project teams. And what tends to happen is you get so many issues, you don't know where to start. and you don't know what to prioritise for improvement. And likewise, we get to the just before the do phase of the PDSA, sorry, that's the acronym PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act. And then they come up with lots of suggestions for improvement, and where do we start? Because I haven't met an organisation yet that has unlimited resources. So the key is to prioritise what you're working on and prioritise what you're going to implement. So the context of the presentation today is mainly from a business perspective, but I think you'll also find some of these tools are really useful. Like, I'm a really sad case. I actually use some of the techniques in my personal life as well. So at the moment, since the topic is prioritisation, how do you currently prioritise? Because I know you do.
I do in terms of timelines, like obviously when things are due.
When things are due?
I'm able to push things back. If
Okay.
some things are able to push back, I do that, and then I tend to put them.
So you work to deadline?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do other people prioritise?
Both importance, but also who else has to be involved. So if something I can handle myself, or it has to go by through other people who you can't control their timing.
Okay, yep. So that's, again, a timeline kind of concept?
Similar, but knowing finding out what other people's agendas are, and
Right.
if I need them, making sure that I'm giving them enough time.
So in a way you're customer focused, so you're trying to respond to other people's requests and
Yeah.
things like that? Mm-hmm. Okay, and you're prioritising the customers, potentially?
Well, our internal customers, so the team
Yes.
that I work with, yeah.
Yep, so they're still customers.
Mm.
Your boss is your customer too. How else do you prioritise?
Sometimes I prioritise based on phase. If some items are vague or they could become quite complex, I try to address them early to identify how vague or how much effort they actually.
So you scope out all the things that need to be done, great, and then you prioritise. Okay. Any other thoughts?
I'm shocking. I'm just hearing all these and going, that's wonderful. And I know these in theory, but I don't put them in play. I probably have all the things that I need to do, and then it's anyone's guess. I mean, it's not that bad, but sometimes I might just need some quick wins, and I'll get the things done that I can get
yes.
done.
Okay, we'll come back to quick wins later because that's quite important.
And then another day, it's doing a bit of, well, these people need this, so that gets rushed through, and then such gets behind. I guess I'm saying is I don't necessarily have a consistent manner.
And that's okay, because there are lots of ways to prioritise and lots of factors to prioritisation.
And if I was honest, I have these plans, but mostly I'm quite reactive
Yeah.
to what
Yes.
That's the way to word it, yeah.
In the moment, all the plans don't.
And sometimes you have to be, because you've got priority customers. Anyone make lists? Okay, so that's another way of, so you're helping yourself, you've got a to-do list for the day. Is anyone sad enough to do something that's not on the list, put it on the list just so that you can cross it out? Isn't that a great feeling? There's a psychological benefit to doing that, I'm sure. So making lists is another way of prioritising, but you've sorted some prioritisation out in your head, and that's how you've come up with your list and which order you're going to do things on your list in. Okay, on your tables, come on in. On the tables there's a couple of handouts. So today, one of my key points is that there are many prioritisation techniques, but today we're going to cover one in particular, which is the prioritisation matrix. So one of them is a list of other prioritisation tools and techniques, and the other one is a bit of a description of the technique that we're going to work on today. So if you're looking at the handout that says other prioritisation tools, I've just dumped on this document a variety of different ways that you can prioritise. So depending on your circumstances, you might use different techniques, but I'll focus in particular on the prioritisation matrix today. So other prioritisation tools. There's one that I love, which is a focus group technique called the customer value tool, and there's a visual of that on the second page. So basically, you have a focus group, and you're asking customers to tell you what it is that they value about your service or your product. You ask them to rate the importance as a percentage of those values. You ask them for a score in terms of performance, and then there's a bit of a numbers game where you can calculate the score and the gap, and then you would work on, so in other words, you would prioritise what the gap, the biggest gap for improvement. Yeah? So that's another way of prioritising, and I threw that one in because that one might be one technique that you haven't seen before. Another way, has anyone heard of dot voting or multi-dot voting as a technique? You have?
I've heard of it, but I've done it.
Yes.
It was great.
Yeah.
We've done it with post-it notes. Yeah. Everyone got a certain number of post-it notes and stuck them up next to the whiteboard.
Yes, post-it notes or sticky dots, and you would have had a list of some sort. So generally, if I'm working with a team, I'm a little bit old school, I still use butcher's paper and pens, or a big list of issues, and then I say to the team, right, everyone gets 5 dots, so it's usually 3 to 5 sticky dots. Go up and vote for the ideas that you like the best, or the issues that you think we should prioritise. And then how do you think we would select the things that we work on by the dots, like
Most dots.
the most dots, yes. So we would prioritise the things with the most dots to work on. So it's voting, it's not consensus. So on the next page, page 3, there's a tool called a weighted index. It's very similar to the customer value tool. I won't go into the detail of that, but you can read through this short description there of how that works. And then Pareto analysis. Has anyone ever heard of Pareto analysis? So if you flick over to page 4, basically if you're collecting data, you can present it in a Pareto chart. And so this example here that I just plucked off the internet is a mailroom complaints analysis, and they've got data about the different types of complaints, and then they've presented the data in order of the highest number of complaints about the issue to the least number, and which, if you were running a mailroom and you had done this activity and you had this data, which one would you pick to prioritise solving? The one with the most, of course. Yes. So would there be a lot of point... So what I'm getting at is you don't have unlimited resources, so you're going to try and prioritise the thing that's giving your customers the most grief. You probably wouldn't put a lot of effort initially into staff mis-sorting mail because that's got a very low number of complaints. So collecting data is really useful to help you prioritise. Did anyone have any questions about the Pareto analysis? No? So getting data helps prioritise. And then the last one, I've thrown in affinity diagram, which strictly speaking is probably not a prioritisation tool, but I find really helpful when you're working with other people and you've got lots and lots and lots of ideas, just to sort those into categories, and then that helps you to see the bigger picture a little bit better and to be able to prioritise better. Does that make sense? So there's a picture of an affinity diagram on page 5 there. So basically you pick the topic categories and just sort all your ideas into different categories. And that way you don't get overwhelmed by the detail. Yeah. So they're all different prioritisation techniques, and in different circumstances you might choose to use different techniques. But today we're going to talk about the prioritisation matrix. So it's a really simple technique, as are most of the improvement techniques in the improvement cycle. And the second handout I've got there, you can follow it along, or I'll just talk through it, and then we'll get right into a practical activity where I'll give you a chance at each table to practice the tool so that you feel comfortable before you leave here. If anyone's got a real world example list of things to do, you're more than welcome to use that. Otherwise, I've just brought an interesting example that you could probably all relate to. So how does the prioritisation matrix work? Basically, you start with a list of things and you number them. So whatever your list is, you're starting with a list and you number them. Then what you do is you decide how much value it would be to do something about that item and what degree of difficulty will it be. So when I'm usually using this, I'm using it with an improvement team. They're trying to sort out a list of ideas of what should they implement. Lots of great ideas, but we haven't got unlimited resources. So we need to work out which ones are going to have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of value, and which ones are going to be easy and which ones are going to be quite difficult. So what kinds of things do you think would you say would be a good definition of value? More money, yep. Or savings, yep. Some financial benefit, yeah, great. Waste cutting, yep, good. Improved customer service. Anything else? Employee engagement, yeah, or improving our culture, yes, excellent. That's a good thought. And what things would make something easy or difficult to do? Resources, yes, like?
More resources is easier, one single person is more difficult. For example, if you're constrained by a project where you've got 2 people in the company,
yes.
If you can only put one person in one particular job, that becomes more difficult in case you need 2 people or 2 brains to work on a problem.
Okay, so when I talk about resources, yes, you're right, it's human resources, and the more human resources you need to do something, probably the more difficult it might get. What other kinds of things would make implementing things difficult?
Technically challenging.
Technically challenging, yes. Whether you need a budget and how much budget, the more budget you need, the more difficult it is to get approval often to implement something. So the degree of difficulty then relies on those kinds of things. So you've got your list, and it's literally as easy as, so number 1 on my list, how difficult will it be to implement? And how much value would I get if I was able to do that, or if we were able to implement? Does that make sense? So basically, and usually I use this in a team environment, so it's a discussion piece. So your team is talking about of these things, and then just placing the numbers into the quadrants and so on. Now, when I learnt this technique, I learnt it from an American, and what he said to me has always stuck in my mind about what the quadrants mean. So if you've got very high value and it's going to be easy to do, that becomes this quadrant, and he described that as the horn of plenty, or the horn of cornucopia. Has anyone ever heard of that before? So what does that conjure up? What sort of image?
Something that keeps on giving you whatever you want.
Yes, okay, so it's like this wicker basket with fruit and vegetables spilling out of it, and it's a symbol to represent plentiful harvest, if you like. Yeah, so that one is the horn of cornucopia. The one down here is, it's not much value, but it's going to be quite easy to do. And he described that one, I'm just going to quickly look at my notes, as the, what was it called, the low-hanging fruit. Yeah. Low-hanging fruit. And you were talking about that earlier with, sometimes I try and just get things done, because they're quick and easy. So that's the quadrant that fits in. The one up here he described as being the prickly pears. Has anyone ever seen a prickly pear? It's the fruit of the prickly pear cactus. What's it like to eat a prickly pear?
It's very difficult to get to.
That's right, because of the thorns. I believe they're about that long.
Well,
sometimes?
No.
No? That long?
No, they're quite small. But
Okay.
There are many.
Many prickles.
And they're quite light and they float and they get everywhere. But when you eat the fruit, it's fantastic.
That's a perfect description.
Yeah.
And has anyone ever tried a prickly pear fruit? Yeah, just one? Does it taste something like a cross between a rock melon and a honeydew melon and some, I don't know, there's nothing to describe it, but it really is lovely. It's lovely and sweet. So it's hard to get to, but once you can taste the fruit, once you get past all those prickles, it's actually really worthwhile. And so that's what this quadrant is about, is it's a prickly pear because it's difficult to implement, but you get high value once you're able to do it. And the bottom quadrant here, he described as stone soup. Boiled stones and water with no taste, so it's hardly worthwhile at all and quite difficult, yeah. So that's the quadrant, and those descriptions have always stuck in my head. So if you have a list, whatever's on your list, and then you put it into the prioritisation matrix with the numbers everywhere, which quadrant do you think would be the quadrant that you would do those things first? Easy question. So number one, so that
High value, low difficulty.
the horn of plenty, yes, high value, low difficulty. Which one is the quadrant where you would get to those ideas if you got everything else on your list done and you had plenty of time? Number 4, the stone supers. Yep.
You got nothing else to do.
Nothing else to do, you're going to get to them eventually, yep. Okay, which of the other 2 quadrants would you prioritise as secondary to this one up here? Would it be the bottom left or the top right? Okay, why?
Because you might need to take a long time to work on it, but once you get there, but then the bottom one you can do lots of low value and it would add up in a quicker amount of time. So I think they're probably even.
Ah, okay. What do other people think? You talked yourself out of your first answer.
I was like, it's a trick question.
No, it's not a trick question.
I still think top one, basically for the time factor, because I may never get to the next option. So I'd rather go the high value even if it's more difficult.
Okay.
The lower ones that may not ever add up to the high value.
Sure. But you talked earlier about having some quick wins, and sometimes a team really needs quick wins, or people need to be able to see that action is happening. So what, anyone else want to have a go?
I think in practicality, I'm picking the one with whoever's breathing down my neck the hardest.
Ah, okay, yes. So that's about value and possibly value to your customer. So the answer is really it could be either of those quadrants as the secondary priority. And in fact, I often usually recommend to teams that they pick a couple out of each. And generally, if we're implementing major change, we would only be working on a handful of things at a time, maybe 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 at the very most. And usually we have enough in the top quadrant to be getting on with before we get to the other things. And only if we had additional resources would we be starting to add those things in. You're looking a little bit puzzled. No? It makes sense? Okay. Do you think you could apply this in your cybersecurity business?
I already do.
Oh, you already do? Okay.
Mainly how I manage projects, I look at this. Mainly the low hanging fruit is wins, but typically the stuff I work on is probably the top right.
Some of the top right, yep. So how many of you here are in business for yourself? Okay, so we've got a few people. I tend to prioritise the fun stuff when I'm working, and I tend to prioritise the customer-facing stuff, not all the boring stuff to me, like website development and what's my strategic plan and what data do I need to collect, and what's in the bank account this month versus next month, and so on. So doing something like this helps me sort out a balance in priority, because you need to get to some of those things if you're going to be in business. Otherwise, you're not going to be sustainable. So it just helps me to prioritise. Yes, the customer does come first, but in terms of the other things, I pick a mix of things.
I tend to think that your top right quadrant is your blue sky stuff, where you're looking at new opportunities, because you always got to look up and see new opportunities and start to implement. And with cybersecurity, I think there's significant opportunities, and it helps you maintain your validity in the marketplace and your value proposition, because you've got that long view.
Good point. When we're talking about within organisations, though, so an improvement team is working on an existing process, depending on what business it is. Everybody's got HR processes, for example. If you're trying to improve some of your HR processes, you might pick a mix of things, and anything that requires IT changes or new systems or whatever tends to be the ones that fall into this quadrant. They have high value, but they're actually going to take quite a bit of resource, and they take time to get approvals and things to do. So in the meantime, you can be doing in between some of the quick wins as well as the high value stuff. Okay, so that's enough for me. Let's have a go at an activity. So I've picked a topic that I'm hoping you can all relate to, and I'm just wondering if the two of you want to join another table, just so that perhaps this one over here. Yeah. So I've picked a topic which is things to do around the house. I'm giving you a list. So I'm giving you a list of things to do around the house. And as a group at each table, I'm hoping you can work through that list and create your own prioritisation matrix and have a discussion about where you think some of those things fit in the quadrants on the matrix. Do you want to sit over here? There's some blank paper on each table, so if someone could be the scribe. There's a blank paper and some pens on each table. If you could draw up your matrix. And what step did I say was the first step in using this technique? Number the list. Thank you. I'm hoping you enjoyed that interesting mixed list. Can anybody tell me what the experience at their table was like?
We had to gather some data, I think, for some of them.
That's right.
Whether we liked grammar or...
Yes,
okay. We had to make a few assumptions.
Yes, that's right. So if you're having grandma come move in with you, yes, there's a whole lot of value judgments. But thank you for sharing that, because I think that's one of the most important things, is to do this activity as a team. So you have your team involved. If you're at home, then your family is part of your team. Maybe your cleaner is part of your team, I don't know. But it's really important to get them involved in the discussion, because you need to agree on what's of value and what criteria you have that make it valuable. But you can see how it could result in quite a bit of conflict in a team if you have different perspectives about what value means. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. Any other experiences?
I think we also had a few differences around the difficulty, which maybe shows that if you are doing it in a team and not for your house, but maybe for your housework, that you might work out things that some people think are relatively low difficulty for them or their skill set that could help in delegating some of these tasks as well.
Good point. So the degree of difficulty, sometimes you have to go away and get some more information in order to make the decision. You're right, but over here they've made cooking meals into peanut butter on biscuits. Is that right? Peanut butter on crackers?
That's gourmet too.
Yes.
Gourmet, okay. So clearly not a high value on nutrition and cooked food. Any other thoughts? Is it easy to do, difficult to do? Pretty easy?
I think deciding where they sit in the chart is the hardest.
Yes.
It's the
Agreeing.
consensus that's probably the more difficult part of it.
Ah, okay. I'm so glad you're mentioning the people side, because the people side of change is critical. If you don't have your team on board as part of the change process and you're not all agreeing and going in the same direction, makes it quite difficult. So getting consensus or going away and getting more data to be able to make good decisions is important. Sometimes it depends on what your improvement effort is, but sometimes it's just important to start somewhere and not to get too hung up on, well, have we got everything in the right quadrant or not? Because if you're making improvement, it's going to make a difference. Yes, it would be great if you're making the improvement that makes the biggest difference, but sometimes it's important just to get started and to get consensus. You can be flexible. Does that make sense? Any other thoughts? Can anyone see themselves using this technique? So I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Austin. Austin, you said you're using this at the moment. Can you just describe how you're using it in your business?
Yeah, so I guess one of the large projects that I manage, so the project is essentially blue sky, so it's top right, but then within the project you have mini tasks and you put the quick wins throughout the project and really challenge people if they're working on your bottom right, because they're spinning their wheels for no reason. So yeah, it's simply we're aiming strategically for the top right, but if they're spinning their wheels, like reprioritise. Whilst you get quick wins in the first few weeks and months, so they actually see progress. And especially that's for your management structure as well.
So the point I like that Austin is making is this is not a static document. It is a document of your priorities at a point in time, but obviously things change day to day, week to week, month to month, and sometimes you have to go back and look at the priorities again and reprioritise based on new information. For sure. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else use this technique normally? No? Can you see yourself using it?
Yeah,
How would you
absolutely.
use it in your business?
It's just definitely writing out my list and pinpointing on my list of 1 to 10, and just looking at observing it before I actually apply it on here, and just saying, like, instead of getting so frazzled and understanding about the different areas and what I'm trying to do, just try and break it down and say, like, what do I need to improve on, or go back and research on, and go back to the client and all those sort of things. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Terrific. So what did you have in your top left-hand quadrant, the high value, low difficulty? What kinds of things did you have in that one?
We had cooking dinner.
Sorry, you had cooking dinner, yes.
The dishes, we got there.
They're right up there. Anything else in that top quadrant?
We had pet care.
Yeah.
It was like taking the dog for a walk and vaccination, because it's high value, because you get the love and
Great.
a life.
Did anyone else have pet care in the top quadrant?
The vaccination is a bit more difficult though, as with the challenging to get the car type of pet.
Yes. So there is space. There is space in the quadrant to say, oh, well, it's a little bit more difficult than that other thing. What did you have in your top quadrant?
Very similar. Plant a tree.
Yeah, it's a tree.
Okay, great. So does it matter whether you've all got different things in that quadrant? Why doesn't it matter? Everyone's different?
Yeah.
It improves satisfaction and improvement for us.
Yeah. So you're still going to be able to prioritise the things to work on together, so long as you've got agreement, you're still making improvement. Yep. And also it comes back to that issue about people have different values. Terrific. Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for participating in that. Did anyone have any questions just before we wrap up about the other prioritisation techniques or this one? So you're pretty happy?
I've got a question. If you've got a very urgent task straight away that you've got to do, where would you put that in the chart? Would that be a high value, for example, or a high difficulty?
Does anybody want to answer that question? Did you hear the question? So if you've got something urgent, which quadrant would you be putting it in?
I think it would be high value if it's your boss or someone that is needing it, so it's got a direct deliverable. But I'm not sure which difficulty.
Any other thoughts?
It would depend on lots of factors.
Yeah.
If there's money that you need to find, if you need to get resources, if you need to find other people to get involved, if you need to go externally to get the product, I think it's about a much bigger picture than it just has to get done now.
I would.
Timeline is to put it as a high priority, but where it's in the quadrant, I think is dependent on task.
So urgent things probably don't make it to this matrix, is what I'm thinking, but I'm not necessarily correct. I guess it depends on what it is.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, for example, the one you had, which was the, for example, what was it? Replace the tap washers. I mean, I guess that's pretty urgent as well. I guess it's pretty high value, but it's, I guess, some people leave their taps leaking for like weeks and months. So it's a little bit urgent, but in the whole scheme of things, in the high value, or I guess it'd be, depending on people, if they have the tools or not, it'd be high difficulty, relatively medium value-ish. So they sort of just leave it dripping for a while, even though there should be some sense of urgency to it. So I'm struggling to, whether or not if it's a very urgent task.
Ah, I see what you're getting at.
Where do you put that in the scale of things?
But it comes back to what is it that's of value? So if you value water and the environment, you would see it as a high priority. And that's the beauty of getting people with different perspectives involved in the prioritisation, because they have different values and they can share information about that with you. Yeah.
I think it also depends on where all your other numbers are.
That's correct, relatively. So it's the relative value and the relative difficulty. Yes, correct. Excellent, thank you. But again, this is not the only prioritisation technique. I've just found it's really useful. Please have a look at some of the other techniques as well, and different techniques apply better in different circumstances. So just to wrap up, this is a simple tool that's part of the improvement cycle and helps you to work through a project or an issue, and is usually team-based.